Good evening. I'm Dr. Basil Considine. I'm here from the ACU Online Writing Center, and today we're going to be talking about how to report your self-test results. Now, this is coming from a assignment in PSYO 301, where you're asked to take a conflict behavior survey. And this is a fairly common assignment. It's a great one to prepare you for job application interviews when they ask you about what your style, what your preferences, how you would lead, and how you would respond to different scenarios. And so one of the purposes of an assignment like this, and one of the reasons why it shows up in so many programs, undergraduate and graduate, is that knowing how your default reactions, your default expectations are, is a great point for deciding whether you want to change that or whether you want to support that. And there's no right or wrong answer there, but often over the course of someone's educational and professional development, they will look at where they are now and say, here are some things that I would like to change. Here are some things that I'm very happy with how they are, and perhaps I want to make sure that they stay that way. And so we'll talk about that a little bit today. So the assignment that we're starting with is coming from a particular course, and this is a course that is near and dear to my heart because at an earlier part of my career, I worked at the Joan B. Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice at the University of San Diego, then a new institution, and it was led by Dr. Joyce New, who was a negotiator for uh, peace dealings in the Balkans and parts of Africa that were experiencing conflict and many other things. And so we work with people who are actively trying to make peace and understanding how people dealt with conflict, how they approached it, how they wanted to go about resolving it, what they needed to feel that they were being heard and understood and represented. That was a major thing. And that's not just for international conflicts. It's something that comes up in relationships, comes up in workplaces. So very important things going on here. And if you're taking this course, I think it's going to be a very valuable one. So the assignment instructions I've broken up just help us understand what the different information is telling you when and why. So it begins with a brief preamble. The purpose of this assignment is just to discover your personal primary conflict style so that you have a better understanding of how you approach conflict in different types of situations. And so the sentence is telling us in part that the focus is going to be on your results and your understanding what they are. So there's going to be a lot of reflection, a lot of what you make of it. And so long as you are actually reflecting on that and doing that to the space requirements, great. Whatever your results are right now are just a measure of what those are right now. Like looking where to point the telescope in the stars. Where you go from there, that's up to you. And in the course of your education and your professional development, a lot of these will probably change. Some of them might be things that you want to move in another direction. Some of them might be some that you want to do better. And as the second sentence says, this enhanced understanding will help you navigate conflict as you encounter it in the future. Now, if you've taken any courses in our uh, marriage and family therapy program, or perhaps in the family management, you'll know that conflict comes up a lot in many different areas, and sometimes it's over very small things. But understanding why things are important to you and why things are important to other people, very, very helpful. Third sentence, it will also increase your self-insight to aspects of your own personality you may not have been consciously aware of. Now, we are all, to some degree, a product of the environments that we grew up in and have lived in. I am from a very large family. I have 10 siblings. Most people these days in the United States do not have that many siblings. And so you might have a remarkably different idea of space management and my versus theirs. And the classic example of when these different aspects come up is when people go off to college and live with someone else of the same age. And discover that things that they have taken for granted, because that's how they always were at their home, are not what the other person is expecting. A common example is borrowing clothes. There are some people who grow up in an environment where that is something they borrow from parents, siblings, etc. And there are other people who that was not their expectation, and they're very surprised when this comes up. And especially if it comes up and they are expecting that, they would have been asked about that, but they weren't. So let's take a look at the instructions. Complete the J. Hall conflict style inventory twice, thinking about two different types of relationships each time. So we're going back through the same set of questions, but applying a different context, because often we have different rules that apply based on our relationship. When I go to my grandmother's house, my grandmother's in her 90s. There are some things that I will do and say in particular ways because I want to be as clear as possible for her, that I don't necessarily do with younger people around me who get certain cultural references, who uh, may appreciate certain lingo, or in her case, like many grandparents, if you are working with someone with hearing loss, you really don't want to confuse them on what they're hearing. So I try and speak a little bit more plainly than normal. And so as you approach this inventory, think about the different relationships. And I recommend taking either one of two courses. Either pick two different relationships where you're really curious how you'd go about those things differently, or uh, pick two that are very different, or that you think will be very different before you take the inventory. Here's why. If you're very interested in what those differences are, you will find it easier to write about the results. And if you don't have a strong preference, if you take very different ones, then you will find it easier to identify the differences. So let's say you were doing family member versus coworker. That's usually not a um, very similar thing, but during the pandemic, a lot of people became aware during the work from home periods that their spouses or significant others had unexpectedly close relationships with the coworker, the work wife, work husband kind of thing. And so if that's something that really interests you about, like, I'd like to know how those are different, then uh, that might be something you want to delve into here. So, to give you another example here, a classic relationship thing, a relationship conflict arises when someone believes that they should be being treated or referred to or addressed or cared for in one way, and they feel that they're being given the care, treatment, comfort, etc., for a different role or a different relationship, and that is not happy. That could be benign, that could be less happy, but if someone starts dating and they feel that they're being moved into the family member status right away, marriage is being talked out immediately. Is that going to be welcome? Is that going to be unwelcome? I don't know. My grandfather proposed to my grandmother the day they met. She said yes. Many decades of happy marriage resulted. Is that the most common outcome of that? I would guess probably not. If I went to someone on the street and proposed today, having just met them, they would probably say no. So when you are looking at this, think about what you are most interested in, or that what you think will give the most fertile fodder for you to discuss. Now, there's a template to organize your results. Make sure that you use that. But let's go ahead and look some more at this. So while all five styles examined in this instrument, while all five styles are appropriate at certain times, most people have one conflict style that they rely on more than any other, even if it isn't the best choice for the circumstances. Think of what people do in a stressful situation as opposed to when they have time to prepare for it. Understanding your tendency to default to one style may help you reflect on its appropriateness as you learn more about a positive approach to conflict. Let's take a look at the rubric for it. So you need to complete it with two different types of relationships in mind. So if you're going to do two friends, make sure one of them is the best friend and the other is, a casual friend or something like that. The student reflected on what the knowledge of their primary conflict style teaches them about themselves. So this is important to make sure that you're not just reporting, but that you're reflecting, that you are asking, what does this mean? How did this come about? And then this third one, how the knowledge of your primary conflict style will affect how you approach future conflict. Now, if you're thinking about it, for each item in the inventory, this gives you three starting questions, or four perhaps. First, what were your responses for the two different things? Second, and how different were those, or similar? Third, so what does this teach you about yourself? And fourth, how will this affect how you approach future conflict? And so looking at that, that's a good starting point for discussion. You, and you can dig into those and certainly take more than one sentence for each. So let's talk about how to cite and reference key course material for this. And the place where we normally get questions is about the style inventory. And if you take the link in the class, you'll see a PDF download. And this is where people start getting confused because it says at the bottom, adapted from Jay Hall's conflict management survey. And so often people will jump in and think, oh, well, it must have been changed. And so I'll need to cite this as a separate course material. And well, I will tell you that adapted from, in this case, having checked the original source, adapted from means that this was transferred to a two-page format to make it easy to administer and not having to buy a copy of the book. And this is a very common thing with the survey instruments. You want to reproduce it accurately so you can compare and contrast the results. And so you cite the original source for it. But, given that this book was printed more than 50 years ago, we're usually going to be reproducing it and adapting it for easy survey administration. So although it is coming from the Blackboard site in your most direct thing, you can cite and reference the original source there. And again, in this case, I checked, it's a faithful transcription of the survey instrument. So here's your reference at the top. It was a book, so we have who wrote it, Hall, J is their first initial. 1969 is when it was published. The title of the book, Conflict Management Survey, a survey of one's characteristic reaction to and handling of conflict between himself and others. And then the publisher, Telemetrics International. Now, if we look back at the bottom of the page here, there are some things that we're leaving out. You can see that the first name J is being abbreviated to the letter, and that the title is going to be uh, reformatted into sentence case as we normally do for book titles and the references. And the city and state where this was published, the Woodlands, Texas, that information is not included in APA 7. If we're going to cite it, we just use Hall 1969. And you can see an example here at the bottom. I assessed myself by completing Hall's 1969 Conflict Management Style Survey. And that is capitalized here because the name of the survey itself, as opposed to the title of the book, the name of the survey itself is a proper noun. In APA style, we capitalize survey names as proper nouns. So how would you cite your survey results? Well, keep in mind a few things first. Your test results are not going to be formally published. They're not going in a journal article. They're not going on a website for everyone to see. And so, according to APA style rules, they do not appear in your references list. Doesn't mean you can't talk about them. Doesn't mean you can't cite them. But we're not going to be doing that in a formal, you have a reference entry, author, date, citation sort of way. So you just refer to them in text. And when you're referring to this, make sure that you're distinguishing between the survey that you completed. This is text like, The first time that I completed the Hall 1969 survey, I received this, or I did this about my relationship with my best friend, or the second. When I took Hall's 1969 conflict management style survey for the second time, I found, and so that's clearly identifying that is the survey that you completed. Do you need to list the whole title all the time? No. All you really need is Hall 1969 and identifying it as a survey. But there'll be some times where the name will be helpful here. And by the way, take a look at this and tell me if you can identify the typo. This is a reminder. Always remember to run a spelling and grammar check to catch things like this. And if we look here at the second set here, make sure that you're referring to your responses to specific prompts. There are times where you will refer generally to things like, oh, I was surprised by my responses to the questions about X. But often than not, you're probably going to be referring to what are the specific numbered situations, situation 1, situation 2, situation 11, that the instrument asks you to respond to. So I noticed that my responses to Hall's 1969 situation 1, so it's referring to a specific item on that survey, differed between the two administrations. This prompt asked about selecting a group negotiator, and I selected A one time and B the other. And tell us how you feel about that, or how you understand that. I believe that this reflects how. And let's just make that a little bit more concrete by looking at an example here. So situation 11 asks, in selecting a member of your group to represent you in negotiating with another group, you would choose a person who, this is going to depend a bit on which group. So if I'm looking at E, would present your group's case accurately while not making commitments that might result in obligating your group to a significantly changed position. If I was doing this for the nonprofit that I manage, I would absolutely like our negotiator to not make promises that will then depart from what we agreed on in advance. On the other hand, if I was answering this with the group of close friends, there are situations where like, okay, well, we'll go with it. And that's not so much a financial obligation, but as a planning thing. Let's pick a very benign conflict for a moment. You go to a restaurant and you have reservations for a place and they want to sit you somewhere else. If my friend goes and takes the lead and they say, all right, guys, we're going to go sit down in this section instead, and they're able to sit us 15 minutes earlier than otherwise. And we're like, okay, well, we sent you to negotiate. We're going to accept this outcome, which would be very different if I was there with my nonprofit and we were looking at, so we scheduled Carnegie Hall, the big fancy auditorium, the famous one, the one that Judy Garland performed at. And you want to send us to this very small unknown place that's hard to get to. So, in some cases, some situations, some groups, you may be happy to have them take that negotiation leeway, and others you may feel that with this group, and no, if we agreed on that, we have to stick to it for whatever sets of reasons. So by all means, tell us about that. I do want to impress that in this assignment, you want to make sure that you are referring clearly to all the things that your assignment asks you to do. And so let's just do a quick recap of what the assignment is asking you to do by looking at the rubric. So we have here, make sure that you complete this survey in twice, and whether you're referring to it as J Hall Conflict Style Inventory or the other name, so long as you have that citation, we're good because the citation identifies the specific thing. So make sure that you do that twice and that you report the results using the template. Make sure that you reflect on what these results tell you about yourself and what you will do with that. Make sure that your responses are a minimum of 200 words each, that they're written in complete sentences, that you've run a spelling and grammar check and done your due diligence to make sure that it flows well and reads clearly, and that you are, again, one more time, following the template that has been provided for this assignment. All right. Well, I think that each time I take an instrument like this, I feel like I learn something about myself. And sometimes that's, oh, I didn't realize how immediately that jumped out to me. And again, when you are looking at this, you have this allocation of points. So it's not a one or the other, but sometimes you find, you know what? I did not realize that that meant so much to me. And that's an interesting thing to know, a very helpful thing to know, especially if you've thought about it in advance and you know that your instinctive or gut reaction is not necessarily the one when you've had a little time to sit back or if you reflected on it in advance. So that's all we have for today. If you have any questions, feel free to send us an email at onlinewritingcenter@acu.edu, to go to my.acu.edu and under Academic Resources, select Online Writing Center to make an appointment, or visit us online. Have a great rest of the day.